6:31, June 6, 1944. The ramp of landing craft, Assault number 1015, drops into the gray water off a beach the planners have codenamed Omaha, and the first men out are cut down before their boots find sand. The sea itself is on fire with tracer. Above the din of engines and shellfire, a company commander is screaming orders that nobody behind him will live long enough to hear. Some men do not even make it to the ramp. They simply fall where they stood, and the tide takes them. Others wade through water reddened by the men ahead of them, dragging 60 pounds of kit through a surf line littered with the dead and the dying, while steel obstacles bristling with mines rise out of the waves like some grotesque iron forest planted there for exactly this purpose. Above the beach, on bluffs rising 170 feet from the shingle, German machine guns traverse back and forth with the patient rhythm of men who have rehearsed this moment for months. This is the opening of the largest amphibious invasion in human history, and on this 5-mile stretch of Normandy coastline, it is already going catastrophically wrong. What follows over the next 6 hours will become the most costly, most contested, and most nearly disastrous episode of the entire Normandy landings. Elsewhere along the invasion front, at Utah, at Gold, at Juneau, at Sword, men are getting ashore in reasonable order and beginning to move inland. At Omaha, they are dying in the water. For a period that morning, senior American commanders offshore will seriously discuss abandoning the beach altogether, diverting follow-on waves to land elsewhere, and writing off the sector as a failure. That this did not happen, that a beachhead was somehow prized out of the sand by men with no working plan, no tanks, and often no officers left alive to lead them, is one of the most remarkable feats of the Second World War. This is the story of why Omaha nearly failed, and of the 6 hours in which a handful of exhausted, frightened soldiers decided, individually and without orders, that they were not going back into the sea. By the spring of 1944, the Allies understood that the invasion of Hitler's Atlantic Wall would only work if overwhelming force could be brought to bear in the first hours ashore, before the German High Command could react and rush reserves to the coast. Omaha Beach sat at the center of the invasion front, a crescent of sand roughly 5 miles long, bounded at each end by cliffs and dominated along its entire length by bluffs that gave defenders a clear field of fire onto every yard of open beach below. Planners knew the terrain was poor. What they did not know, until it was too late to change the plan, was that the beach's garrison had quietly changed. Allied intelligence had assessed Omaha as held by a single static coastal defense formation, the 716th Infantry Division, a unit of limited quality composed substantially of older conscripts and Ost battalions of dubious reliability. In fact, in the weeks before the invasion, the German 352nd Infantry Division, a full-strength, well-trained formation under General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, had moved into the sector for an anti-invasion exercise and simply stayed. Aerial reconnaissance had not picked up the change with sufficient clarity, and the men who would storm Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th were about to walk into roughly twice the defensive strength that their intelligence briefings had promised them. The defenses themselves had been built under the direction of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who understood better than most German commanders that any invasion had to be defeated on the beaches themselves, in the first hours before Allied naval and air superiority made movement inland unbearably costly. Rommel had inspected the Atlantic Wall in person during the winter of 1943 and 1944, and had been appalled by what he found: a defensive line that existed largely on paper, thinly manned, and dependent on the assumption that any invasion could be met by mobile reserves held well inland. He had spent the months since driving his garrisons to lay millions of mines, plant obstacle belts across every accessible beach, and flood low-lying ground behind likely landing zones, all on the theory that an invasion had to be crushed within the first 24 hours or not at all, because after that the weight of Allied material and air power would make any German counterattack prohibitively costly. Along Omaha, Rommel's engineers had constructed a belt of obstacles across the tidal flat, arranged in bands running seaward from the high water mark so that a landing craft attempting to reach the beach at any state of the tide would have to pass through at least one row. Steel hedgehogs, made from lengths of angle iron welded into a shape resembling a child's jack, sat low in the sand, capable of tearing open the hull of a landing craft that struck one at speed. Belgian gates, steel lattice barriers salvaged originally from the fortifications of the Maginot Line and weighing over a ton apiece, stood in rows further out, many fitted with mines lashed to their frames. Wooden stakes, driven into the sand at an angle and tipped with captured Teller mines, weighted closer to shore, angled precisely to catch a craft's flat bottom as it came in on the rising tide. Naval and Army engineers assigned to clear these obstacles ahead of the main landing would themselves suffer appalling casualties that morning, working in the open under direct fire with explosive charges strapped to their bodies, and by some assessments, a substantial proportion of the specialist demolition teams tasked with blowing gaps through the obstacle belt became casualties before their work was done. Above the beach, a network of concrete strongpoints, the Widerstandsnester, numbered and catalogued by German engineers with the same bureaucratic thoroughness applied to every other part of the Atlantic Wall, covered every exit with interlocking machine gun and artillery fire. Crucially, these positions had been sited not to face the sea directly, but to fire along the beach itself, in enfilade, so that a soldier sheltering from the guns of one position walked straight into the arc of another. Some of the larger positions housed captured French, Czech, or Polish artillery pieces of various calibers, protected behind meters of reinforced concrete that the naval bombardment, brief and imprecise as it was, had barely scratched. The Allied plan to overcome all this rested on 3 pillars, and at Omaha, every one of them would fail or fall dramatically short. Naval and aerial bombardment was meant to shatter the German strongpoints before the first wave landed. Instead, poor visibility and a fear of hitting their own troops pushed the heavy bombers of the U.S. 8th Air Force to release their loads late, and nearly all of the 1,285 tons of bombs dropped that morning fell inland of the beach defenses, leaving the bunkers almost entirely intact. Specialized armor, the duplex-drive Sherman tanks fitted with canvas flotation screens and twin propellers, was meant to swim ashore ahead of the infantry and provide close support against the strongpoints. Launched too far from shore in a sea far rougher than the system had been designed for, 27 of the 29 tanks of the 741st Tank Battalion foundered and sank, drowning most of their crews, so that the infantry hit the beach with almost no armored support at all. And the tide and current, stronger than forecast, pushed landing craft east of their intended sectors, scattering units, separating men from their officers, and landing many companies in front of strongpoints their assault plans had never accounted for. The problem, in short, was not merely a strong defense. It was a strong defense meeting an assault plan that had come apart before a single soldier set foot on the sand. The men who waded ashore that morning belonged chiefly to 2 American infantry divisions, the battle-hardened 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one, veterans of North Africa and Sicily, and the 29th Infantry Division, a National Guard formation making its combat debut. They landed along a series of designated sectors given the phonetic names of the period: Charlie, Dog Green, Dog White, Dog Red, Easy Green, Easy Red, Fox Green, and Fox Red, running west to east along the crescent of sand. At Dog Green, in front of the strongpoint the Germans called Widerstandsnest 68 near the village of Vierville, Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment was cut to pieces within minutes of landing, losing most of its strength before it had advanced a single yard. Some accounts suggest the company suffered casualties approaching 2/3 of its men in the opening minutes alone. Further along at Easy Red and Fox Green, similar scenes played out in front of other strongpoints whose garrisons had survived the bombardment untouched and whose machine guns now had clear, unobstructed fields of fire across open sand offering no cover beyond the shingle bank at the high water mark. What broke the deadlock in the end was not a plan. It was individual initiative, exercised by men who had every reason to simply stay pinned down and every reason not to. Brigadier General Norman Cota, assistant commander of the 29th Division, moved along the shingle at dog white under fire, personally organizing scattered, leaderless groups of soldiers and driving them forward, reportedly telling one group of rangers pinned near the seawall that two kinds of men were going to stay on that beach, the dead and those about to die, and that everyone else needed to get off it. Small parties of men, often no larger than a squad, worked their way up gullies and draws between the strong points, using Bangalore torpedoes to blow gaps in the wire, using naval gunfire directed by radio from ships close inshore to knock out individual bunkers, and by mid-morning, isolated groups had begun to crest the bluffs above the beach and take the German positions from the flank and rear, the one direction Rommel's defenses had never been built to resist. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps this channel keep making documentaries like it. Individual accounts from those mid-morning hours give some sense of how thin the margin between failure and success actually was. Near the Colleville Draw, a mixed group from the 16th Infantry Regiment, no more than a couple of dozen men under a single surviving lieutenant, worked their way up a gully choked with wire and mines, using bayonets to probe the ground ahead of each step, and reached the high ground above the beach roughly 2 hours after landing, well before any organized follow-on force. At Pointe Ras de la Percée, on Omaha's western flank, isolated parties from the 2nd Ranger Battalion, having already scaled the cliffs at nearby Pointe du Hoc that same morning under a separate but related mission, added further pressure to the German flank from a direction the defenders had not expected to be threatened at all. What is striking about these accounts, drawn from after-action reports and post-war interviews, is how little coordination existed between them. Companies that had been carefully organized and rehearsed for weeks in England landed scattered across the wrong sectors, mixed in with men from other units, often missing their officers entirely, and the eventual breakthrough was less a single coherent advance than dozens of small, disconnected actions happening within an hour or two of one another along the length of the beach. Naval gunfire support deserves particular credit for the eventual breakthrough. Destroyers of the U.S. Navy, several of them coming in so close to shore that their keels risked touching bottom, engaged individual German strongpoints over open sights at ranges under 1,000 yards, providing the close, accurate fire support that the earlier bombing and rocket barrages had failed to deliver. It is difficult to overstate how different this was from the German response along the rest of the Atlantic Wall that day, and difficult, too, to overstate how different Omaha was from the German equivalent of a fortified coastal defense intended to stop a landing outright. Whereas Rommel's static defenses relied on a single, rigid killing zone at the water's edge with limited ability to counterattack once that line was breached, the American response at Omaha, however chaotic and improvised, showed a flexibility that let leaderless small units solve local problems on their own initiative, a doctrine of decentralized command that German formations, tied to a rigid chain of orders from higher headquarters, generally lacked. Comparisons are sometimes drawn with the British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword, where specialized armor, the funnies of the 79th Armored Division, including flail tanks for mine clearance and armored vehicles designed to demolish concrete obstacles directly, reached the beach in far greater numbers and in far better order than the American duplex drive tanks managed at Omaha, contributing to notably lighter Allied casualties on those sectors that same morning. By early afternoon, the situation, while still desperate, had stabilized. German ammunition at several strong points was running low. Reinforcements that Kreis's division might have used for a counterattack were being drawn away to deal with British and Canadian pressure further east, and the exits off the beach, the draws leading up through Vierville, Les Moulins, Saint-Laurent, and Colville, were, one by one, being prized open by American troops fighting their way up from the flanks. By nightfall, a beachhead existed at Omaha, but it was shallow in places barely a mile and a half deep, and it had cost more than anywhere else on the invasion front that day. Casualty estimates for Omaha on June 6th alone generally range between 2,000 and 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, out of roughly 10,000 Allied casualties across all 5 invasion beaches combined, meaning that this single 5-mile stretch of coastline accounted for somewhere close to a quarter to a third of the entire day's losses. The psychological effect on the Germans defending Omaha was, in a strange way, precisely the opposite of what the scale of American casualties might suggest. Prisoners taken later that day reported genuine shock, not that the Americans had landed, but that they had kept coming, wave after wave, absorbing losses that Wehrmacht doctrine assumed would break an attacking force's will to continue, and simply refusing to stop. Several German accounts from the sector describe a growing sense among defenders through the late morning that, despite inflicting horrendous casualties, they were not, in fact, winning, because the attackers would not withdraw. It is worth being honest here about what is documented and what is inference. Precise German casualty figures for the 352nd Division's defense of Omaha on June 6th remain harder to establish than the American figures, and estimates offered in popular accounts should be treated with appropriate caution, but the broader pattern of a defense that inflicted disproportionate losses yet still lost the ground is well supported by the post-war record on both sides. The legacy of Omaha Beach is complicated by the very closeness of the outcome. Had the German 352nd Division not been drawn away to counter British and Canadian progress further east that afternoon, had the weather delayed the invasion by even a day, allowing the defenders more warning, or had the specialized armor and pre-landing bombardment succeeded as planned, it is entirely plausible that the beachhead at Omaha would have collapsed, with consequences for the wider invasion that are difficult to calculate but were, at the time, seriously feared by commanders offshore. In the years since, the lessons drawn from Omaha's near failure fed directly into how the Allies planned subsequent amphibious assaults in the Pacific, and, more broadly, into post-war doctrine on the importance of accurate, close-support naval gunfire and the dangers of committing untested specialized equipment, such as the duplex drive tanks, in sea conditions beyond their design limits. The command failures exposed at Omaha, particularly around the duplex drive tanks and the reliance on bombing runs that had never been properly tested against beach defenses of this density, were absorbed quickly enough that they shaped the far larger amphibious operations the Americans would mount against Japan later that same year and into 1945, where naval gunfire was planned with considerably more caution about what bombardment alone could realistically achieve against fortified positions. Historians remain divided on how close the beachhead genuinely came to collapse. Some point to the fact that no serious German counterattack was ever mounted against the shallow lodgment that afternoon, largely because the 352nd Division's reserves were already committed elsewhere along the front, and argue that the beach, while horrifically costly, was never truly in danger of being thrown back into the sea. Others note that senior American commanders offshore, including officers on General Bradley's own staff, seriously discussed diverting follow-on waves away from Omaha that morning, and take this as evidence that the outcome remained genuinely uncertain for several hours. Both readings can be true at once. The beachhead may have been more secure than it felt to the men fighting for it, and it still very nearly wasn't. Today, the beach itself is a place of quiet remembrance rather than remembered chaos, its calm sand overlooked by the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer, where thousands of American dead from the Normandy campaign lie in orderly rows above the same bluffs that 80 years ago were the last obstacle between a shattered invasion and a beachhead that, against every reasonable expectation that morning, held. Remnants of the Widerstands Nestor can still be found set back from the modern beach car parks and holiday villas, their concrete walls scarred but standing, and at low tide the rusted stumps of a handful of the original obstacles are occasionally still visible in the sand, half-buried reminders of a morning that very nearly ended in disaster. 6:31 became 12. 31 became darkness, and somewhere in those 6 hours a battle that senior commanders had privately begun to consider a failure turned, without any single dramatic reversal, into a foothold that would not be given up. There was no single moment of victory at Omaha Beach, no flag planted, no clean turning point that a camera happened to catch. There was only a slow, grinding accumulation of small, desperate decisions, a sergeant here choosing to blow a gap in the wire rather than wait for orders that were never coming, a destroyer captain there choosing to risk his ship's keel on the sand to put one more shell into one more bunker, a wounded man deciding to keep crawling rather than to lie still. What was achieved that day was not a victory of planning, because the plan had failed within minutes of the first ramp dropping. It was a victory of the men on the ground, in spite of the plan, bought at a cost that the planners had not budgeted for and that the survivors would carry for the rest of their lives. Omaha Beach was meant to fall in.